Hello everyone, as you can see by my hat and my suspenders, I am Detective Minion Michelle, and today we're going to be looking at a fairly interesting case called Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Yes, I think this is one of his more well-noted works, or at least one that didn't get made into a really bad TV series, as far as from what I could tell. But basically, it takes place in what the title is called, Salem's Lot, which is in Maine. So yes, we do have a little bit of Stephen King cliches thrown in there, but I think overall the execution of the story, I think, really works and leaves a lot open to mystery and sort of putting certain pieces together. So I think it's definitely one of those works that I think works for what it's going for. So basically, the main plot really starts off after the exposition. So with the exposition, we have our introduction to the main character, Ben Mears, who is a writer, a famous writer actually, I think a best-selling author actually. And this takes place in the 1970s, and he decides to visit Salem's Lot, which is where he grew up as a child. And then he encounters the various people that live there, including Susan, who ultimately becomes his love interest, Matt, who is a teacher at the local school, Father Callahan, who is a priest, and Mark, who is an intelligent little boy. And by intelligent, I mean this kid is pretty smart for his age. So basically, after we get all of sort of that exposition throughout the story, again, the introductions to the characters sort of go along as the plot continues, but these characters that I've mentioned to you really, I think, take up the majority because, again, we do have points where the story sort of gives you a sense of the different people within the town, but they're not really the center focus of the town. So largely these characters that I've mentioned, the ones that I think get the most presence within the book. So what ultimately is Salem's Lot about? Well, basically, once Ben Mears, the main character, comes into town, he realizes that after being in the town for a little while, that ultimately there is a death as well as a disappearance of two brothers and two children brothers. So we have the death of Danny Glick and then the disappearance of Ralphie. So those are the two kids that ultimately end up sort of biting the dust, so to speak. So basically the mystery sort of starts from there because nobody really knows what happened to them. Danny's death is kind of fairly mysterious and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the fact that they can't find his brother also creates a sense of something really bizarre is going on. And so this is where we ultimately see the real start of the story, and where the story ultimately ends up leading to. And this ends up again leading into more deaths, more sort of destruction. It's sort of like the town is kind of destroying itself in a way throughout the story, and you'll sort of see this as it progresses onward. So, but it really starts off with these two children being either dead or gone, meaning supposedly dead. So really that's how it sets itself up, and Ben Mears and Susan in particular, as well as Matt and then eventually Mark and the Father Callahan, ultimately go out and try to solve sort of the mystery surrounding this. And you'll see how they go about that and whatnot if you choose to read the story. So that's really ultimately what this story centers around. Now, even though the wiki page in particular for what I researched, it says it classifies this story as a horror story, Although I think there's a lot more mystery to it as opposed to horror. Yes, there's horror things that do happen, and there are certain horror elements within this story, but largely it is centered around a mystery because ultimately that's what the characters are trying to figure out. It's not like they're in a perilous situation um, right from the get-go, and they're trying to put pieces together as opposed to being the ones who are captured and trying to escape, which is, I think, what usually a lot of horror movies and books have sort of put the premise on. But again, there are horror elements within there, and I really don't want to give away those horror elements because I think that's definitely spoiling the story for my audience here. But it's really well written. And it has its way of grasping the audience and getting the audience invested and sort of seeing the world that Stephen King's trying to create with this story. The interesting thing is that you can really tell that Stephen King loves Maine. I mean, there's just something about Maine that he just adores, and I guess I could understand that because again, it really emphasizes um, it's really emphasized within a lot of his other works, and also because he grew up there. So I think it makes sense that there would be these kinds of things within there um, that would ultimately associate with Stephen King. But I like how the characters, they do have a depth, and they're not kind of the cliche um, characters that we see within Stephen King. But again, they do have maybe some elements of that. You'll see how Ben Mears sort of has a past. You'll see how certain things that end up happening are kind of similar to what we would see in other Stephen King books. But I think the overall execution of the story works, as opposed to some of his other less noted, more TV series based works. So this is definitely, I think, one that is worth recommending for this Halloween season, and it sort of revolves around fall. I think within the writing, Stephen King mentioned sort of the sort of atmosphere of the town in fall, and it really tries to, I think, encapsulate that atmosphere of what ultimately ends up happening in the story and how it sort of relates to the season of fall and again, even though it doesn't dress Halloween specifically, and again, there are different seasons that happen throughout the story, it still tries to primarily focus in on that change in season, and it's just something that I think makes his writing engaging and interesting to read. And again, there's a lot of characters that kind of are just maybe a little bit shoehorned in, and they're not really all that interesting. But again, I think it's supposed to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of people within the town, as opposed to going in depth into them. It's just sort of it's supposed to paint a picture like you're an outsider, I think. And I think it tries to paint it in that way of because Ben Mears, the main character, is sort of an outsider to this town because he hasn't been there in years, and so it really puts that kind of label onto it and sort of runs with it throughout, as sort of on the outside looking in. And even though there's certain things that are wrapped up, there's still a certain sense of eeriness and a little bit of a mystery and not much of a resolution at the end. It's not like it's wrapped up for you in all one big nice bow. And I think for ultimately what this story is going for, it works because again, there is more of an emphasis on the supernatural as opposed to being grounded into reality and having conclusions. So I think that's really what sets this story apart. And it's definitely, I think, worth recommending if you enjoy these kinds of works. If you enjoy Stephen King, I'm sure that you'll enjoy this one in particular. It's not as horror-ish as some of his other works like It, or again, it's not as crazy, I think, as something like Carrie. So I would say this is probably my favorite that I've read from Stephen King, to be honest, because I think it's not as over the top, and it kind of takes its audience a little bit more seriously. And I think that ultimately works to the story's advantage. But ultimately, I think that's really all I can say. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'm more than happy to answer them. But yes, I probably got to go off and find another mystery to solve. But I've probably got a handy list here of things that I can figure out. But I don't know if I'll be back or not. I doubt it. But if I am, that would be great. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a pleasant month of Halloween. Take care.